In Halo Infinite, you step into the suit of the iconic Spider Chief to explore the shattered ring of Zeta Halo. I think this is the part where I'm supposed to say that the grappling hook and open world design bring a fresh new way to play the series you grew up with, by grapple punching everything in sight. Unfortunately, this is where things get a little bit complicated, because unlike many other people, probably unlike you as a viewer, I didn't grow up with Halo. In fact, outside of a couple of very short play sessions, several of which were multiplayer, the series is completely new to me. And so, you can consider this an outsider's review of Halo Infinite's campaign. And I know, you clicked on this video expecting an angry rant about Halo Infinite's multiplayer. But the truth of the matter is, I'm not the right person to make that video. I don't really play shooters, and I've never really played competitive shooters. I could certainly look at what other people are saying, and I could give my opinion there. In fact, that's something I may talk about in the future. But for today, I'm only going to be looking at the campaign. I'm only going to be judging Halo Infinite on its value as a $60 single-player experience. And so, let's drop into it, because that's exactly what the game's opening cutscene does. Let's watch it together.
Would you humor me? Going to die. How would you live your life differently?
And I am the last face you will ever see.
And this does a great job of dropping you into the headspace of Master Chief. You're a Spartan, a killing machine who focuses on the mission regardless of the odds. And if there's a large number of aliens trying to kill you, that just makes this a target-rich environment. All of the story sequences were well written and well voice acted. There were times where the whispered bits of Cortana's past were genuinely haunting. But unfortunately, I was also quite confused. I'm sure if I had more context, especially context about who Cortana was aside of that weird voice assistant in my Windows, maybe if I had played the previous games, then it might have been a better first experience. But as it was, if you're completely new to Halo, parts of a story will lose you, at least at first. And because I don't know everything, I'm not going to try to look for plot holes or poke holes in the story, because I do want to keep this mostly spoiler-free. But I was genuinely confused for about 2/3 of the campaign, after which things started to fit together and make a lot more sense. I never quite understood who the Banished were, or why we were fighting them, beyond the fact that they just tried to shoot me, and the natural reaction is grapple punch them in the throat. Now, I also don't really play games for the graphics. But if you want to give your graphics card a good stretch, and your graphics card is modern enough to actually run the game on decent settings, then Halo Infinite looks quite good. I especially like the level of detail in the small touches, things like the guns, enemies, and the various vehicles. Right down to some of the battle damage, to show that you're not just piloting a random Scorpion that's been sitting in a warehouse. This Scorpion's seen stuff, and probably blown up some aliens in the past. Not that graphics would really matter if gameplay didn't hold up. And when it was working well, Halo Infinite's combat was very enjoyable. I especially liked the way combat functioned when I was completing missions in the open world. It was great to be able to grab a weapon off of a handy rack or off of a dead enemy and just start blasting away at foes. It felt like a good mix of weapons for short, medium, and long-range combat. Overpower weapons one-shot everything. Oh, sorry, those are called power weapons, but they're pretty broken, so I like mine better. And normally, the downside of these weapons is they have very limited ammo. But if you give them to friendly Marines, you'll be walking around with a gank squad, and it felt pretty good. And of course, if you feel like the odds are stacked against you, because let's be honest, they are, and you don't want to have a fair fight, then just grab a Scorpion tank, since if someone's going to bring a tank to the gunfight, you definitely want to be that someone. Now, unfortunately, while I did enjoy the game's combat most of the time, this started to fall apart on bosses. At best, they were cinematic annoyances. At worst, they were horrible bullet sponge slogs. In general, the pace of combat in Halo Infinite is pretty fast. A few well-placed shots will take out most enemies. But bosses? You could empty your entire clip into their eye, and their health will barely move. To make matters worse, most boss attack patterns were really simple, but if they hit you once or twice, you're gonna go down. So the fights weren't very forgiving. Combine this with the fact that you're in serious danger of running out of ammo and having to scrounge around for a new weapon, especially when you went into the fight with the wrong weapon because you didn't always know it was definitely a boss, well, that felt pretty bad. But on the other hand, some bosses provided a good selection of effective weapons and a large open room to fight in. These were decent, but it felt more cinematic than anything. And the ones that provided lackluster weapon options, or forced you to fight at extremely close range, were absolutely atrocious. I wish the bosses had been balanced more like the open world elite encounters. The elites are very dangerous, but they don't have absurd health. If they get a few good shots in, they'll drop you, but if you get a few good shots in, you'll drop them. It was much more fun to fight them, and to collect all the weapon upgrades. So much so that, I might have killed all of them. Not out of a sense of moral purpose, mind you. Not even necessarily for all the upgrades, as I had no intention to use several of the guns. But it was fun. Does this make me the monster? I'll leave that for you to decide. And while you're deciding, if you've decided to stick around to this point in the video, then consider leaving a like and showing it to a friend. For more reviews, or my thoughts on various game design elements, or maybe just to keep up with the gaming news, sub to the channel and ring that bell to be notified whenever I upload. And finally, if you want to support me over on Patreon, you can do so for as low as $1 a month. And did you know that $1 a month would do more to support me than watching over 40 hours of monetized videos on my main channel? But, oh right, I was talking about mass murdering Banished. I don't think that's a war crime. Or at the very least, I'm pretty sure the Banished killed anyone who'd be court-martialing me, so I guess it doesn't really matter anymore. A little bit ago, I mentioned that weapons in Halo Infinite felt great to use, and now I want to expand a bit more on that. My favorite weapon class was, by far, the kinetic weapons, the BR-75, Riven Mauler, or Striker Sidekick being particular favorites, the weapons that I carried for a majority of the campaign. I liked the way there was direct feedback for hitting enemies, and if you get a good clean headshot, that enemy is going to drop dead. But these weren't the only weapons I used. There were plenty of times that I grabbed a Disruptor, since it was very effective at disabling vehicles and eating away at higher health foes. The Stalker Rifle also proved to be a surprisingly effective long-range choice, and even though I had a lackluster first experience with a Sentinel Beam, by the end, it felt really good. Overall, I didn't find myself favoring a lot of a shock weapon, because it often felt easier to grapple to the vehicle and pull the occupant off, rather than shock and disable it. Or if I was trying to shock an enemy, I could do so with the AoE from my grapple. Did I mention I tended to use the grapple maybe a little bit more than I should, especially as I got to late game. If you don't see me doing it too much in the footage, that's because I wanted to keep most of that to the early game so as to avoid spoilers. Now, the plasma weapons did a lot of damage, but they felt very floaty. I didn't have a great sense of aiming at a spot and then hitting that spot. I think this was due to the soft aim assist from the targeting, but it also made them feel very bad to me, so I ended up avoiding them. Initially, I didn't give Hardlight much of a chance, because it was very hard to see when I was making contact with an enemy. But in the later missions, the game just threw Sentinel Beams in my face. It pretty much said, you have to use this weapon. There's a ton of them, there's a ton of ammo, and they're very effective against the enemies. After giving it a shot, I found out it was well worth it. And then of course, we have the power weapons like I mentioned earlier. They're slow to reload, and have very limited magazines and ammunition. There were definitely a couple times early on where I'd pick up a power weapon and I'd think, hey, this is cool. Oh, it only has 2 shots. That's fine. I'll just go grab some ammo. Then I couldn't, because the sniper doesn't use kinetic ammo. It uses power ammo. And the cinder shot doesn't use hard light. It uses power. But once I got over that confusion, it felt pretty good to grab a power weapon, use it to blast the enemies, and then, when it ran out, just grab the nearest thing at hand and keep on blasting. Of course, like I mentioned earlier, my favorite use for power weapons was to give them to nearby friendly Marines. I might only get 4 shots out of a skewer, but the Marines seemed to be able to get dozens, and it was a very effective way to turn the tide on some of the trickier open-world sections like readouts, since even though the Marines struggled with their default weapons, with power weapons, they were a force to be reckoned with. Though I did run into one issue where the Marines would kind of stand around obliviously as I dropped in a vehicle, and it fell right on their head. But Spider Chief needs his tanks, so it was a small price to pay. They will be missed, and be sure to type F in the comments to pay respects to all the fallen Marines who died so that I could use Scorpion tanks. When it came to open combat, both allies and enemies used cover pretty well, and had a good mix of aggressive and passive play. I could get shots in, or I could duck behind cover and reload. They'd often throw grenades if I was behind cover, so I'd have to dodge, duck, or weave. And if they were firing at me, well, to be honest, it felt like I was fighting a group of aimbots. Even though, in some cases, I guess that was what I was fighting. And the enemies were also quite good at dodging thrown grenades, but not nearly as good at dodging a grenade that they dropped because I shot them. So that became one of my favorite tactics, especially getting into the late game. Flaws aside, I enjoyed the game's open world aspects, being able to grab a vehicle, grapple around, or just find something nearby to do. I also like the fact that the world wasn't huge. Too often, when I'm playing an open world game, it feels like most of the gameplay time is spent traveling and not doing something meaningful. So I'm very glad that Halo Infinite avoided this problem. Should you play Halo Infinite's campaign, and is it worth $60? After having beat the entire campaign, and even jumping back in to do a little bit on Legendary, my overall feeling is that there's a wild inconsistency in the level of refinement in some missions. It feels like the game can't decide if it's a punishing restrictive corpse haul, where every mistake's going to cost you, and you're desperate to shoot anything at all because you have barely any guns and barely any ammunition, or if it's a Doom-esque fantasy of being the Slayer Spartan, who's not trapped on a ring with all the banished. They're trapped on a ring with a Spartan, and he has all the tools and guns to prove it. So, my experiences with Halo Infinite's campaign were bittersweet. When it worked, it was a blast. So much so that I'm probably going to go back and play some of the older Halo titles. The Master Chief Collection has been sitting on my Steam for a while, and I could always do a was it good for the Master Chief Collection games. But when it didn't work, it felt frustrating and unpolished, lacking the weapons needed, unless of course you knew to bring them in ahead of time, or you were in a room that was just way too small. I'd love to play the version of Halo Infinite that got another 6 months or year of polish and refinement. And if you're a big fan of the Halo series, or a big fan of shooters in general, I think you'll enjoy Halo Infinite's campaign, and I think it'll be worth your $60. But if you're someone who isn't really into shooters, I suggest dabbling a bit in the multiplayer, and for now, maybe giving the campaign a pass, unless the gameplay really grabs you, because you'll be feeling lost in the early game narrative. Most of the antagonists have no real motivation beyond me shoot me kill, and so it feels like your motivation is me shoot me kill. But all that said, what would I rate Halo Infinite? Well, let me see what I can go grab off that guy's corpse. Looks like I got playing a Spider Chief in a better than Ubisoft open world out of 10. So that's what I'll go with. But what do you think? Did you find Halo Infinite's campaign to be a disappointment? Or a return to form that was promised to fans of the series, regardless of whether this is your first Halo game or you've played every Halo game? If you have any experiences, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, be sure to put them down in the comments below, or join the Discord, where you can ask questions, get build help, and hang out with the community. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. They're awesome, and they get to show it by having their name on screen in the credits of all my videos. So if you want to see your name here, be sure to check the link in the description. You can also help support me by purchasing Steam games through my Nexus. And if you want a water bottle or a cool shirt, I have a link to my official merch shop in the description. I hope you learned something today, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.